Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Rigo Vela, Community Manager on the Cisco Learning Network. In today's session, we will be covering ISE Device Administration with our presenter, Krishnan Tharuvengadam. Before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of very quick housekeeping notes. First, I wanted to let everyone know that we will be launching a few poll questions throughout the webinar, and they will be available in the poll panel located on the right side of your event screen. And before we actually launch one of these polls, we will inform you during the live presentation so that you can be prepared to submit your answers. Next, if you have any question during the session, we ask that you please use the Q&A panel and not the chat window. That would make it a lot easier for our panelists to keep track of the incoming questions, and they can be answered in a timely manner. Also, if you experience any audio issues during the live session, I do recommend using the call-in number that I will be posting in the chat window momentarily. And lastly, at the end of this webinar, you will get a short pop-up survey, and we would really appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to answer some questions and share with us your feedback about the presentation. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our presenter, and he'll kick off our session for today. Krishnan, on to you.
Thank you, Rigo. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone, based on wherever you are. My name is Krishnan Tharuvengadam, and today's session is about device administration. So, what is device administration? Before we jump into it, right, and I want to collect some information about your thoughts about device administration. So the first poll question, Rigo, please open up the poll. What do you use for device admin right now? TACACS, A, Radius, both, neither. So if your answer is neither, the answer D, if you can specify a reason, I would really appreciate it. That'll give us an insight as to why you have that choice. I'll give it a few seconds, and then we'll start. Okay, let's start. Device admin. Before that, let me close the polling window. ISE Device Administration. Here is the agenda for today's discussion. I'll cover a very high-level view of what a device administration is, and then quickly jump into TACACS, and TACACS is the heart of ISE Device Administration, and show you a live demo of how TACACS works. And we'll be using an example of a router. Right? And then, typically I've been asked by a lot of customers that, okay, so I have device administration, but my devices, network devices, do not support TACACS. What do I do? Right? And that is, we do support Radius, so we will talk about that. And then we'll also cover the difference between Radius versus TACACS. Why do you want TACACS over Radius, or vice versa, right? And we will talk about best practices, and policy design is one of the one of the key items that you need to think about when you are managing your devices using ISE. So we will talk about that, and then finally we will cover multi-factor authentication. MFA stands for multi-factor authentication using Duo. Okay, and then we will also give few minutes, 5-10 minutes for Q&A. All right, so let's start. So what is device administration? At a high level, right? You and your administrators in your network, when you manage your devices, you log into your device every day to perform certain tasks. Based on wherever you are, you log into only certain type of devices. You're not allowed full access in every type of devices. And this is based on the role, this is based on the location, this is based on the device type, and so many other factors. So the art of managing these devices comprehensively and gather statistics and data from these devices is called device administration. Now, if you think about the device admin, you have users in different roles. You have network admin who might have full access to the network devices, and the network admin may not have access to security devices. You have help desk admin who might have access to, might have limited access to the network devices who may not have access to the security devices. It depends on the role of the help desk admin as well. Typically, right, they open up a secure shell session or a telnet remote console session and log into the switches or routers or whatever devices and gather information from those devices. Okay, so it is important to provide differentiated access based on who the user is and what the user role is, and other factors as well. We will talk about that in a little bit. Now, in ISE deployment, there are 4 pillars for the device administration, and these 4 items interact with each other. Let's look at these. The first one is admin users and automation tools. So admin users and automation tool typically talks to the switches, firewalls, and the network management systems, right? And they wanted to manage these devices, but the policies reside in ISE. ISE provides the policies for the admins to log in, and it provides the right set of privileges and permissions based on the policies. Now, ISE also uses external authentication sources such as Active Directory, RSA, Duo, and so on. So how does it work? Now, the admin users open up a secure shell session or open up a browser for a wireless controller and so on, and they will be allowed access. They will be initially authenticated and allowed access based on the role, based on what the device they need access to, and so on. And ISE uses the external authentication server to verify the credentials. Okay, now that said, let's take a deeper look at how TACACS work. In fact, TACACS is a AAA protocol. So what is AAA? AAA stands for Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting. Right? Radius is another AAA protocol. But TACACS is meant for device administration. In this example, I am not covering accounting, and that's for a reason. It's for brevity, and it's for it's for you to see the flow in an easy way. And TACACS also provides 2 other events based on command. So these are I call these things command events, and these are command authorization and command accounting. So let's take a look at these. How does it work? Say, for example, Jane logs into the network device, and she provides the username and password. The authentication is complete. Right? ISE uses the username and password and validates the credentials. The authentication becomes complete. So that is the authentication phase. Once authentication becomes complete, what Jane expects is a prompt, is a switch or a router prompt. Right? And she's granted a switch or a router prompt, and she's provided the appropriate privilege level based on her user role, whether she's an admin, whether she's a network admin, help desk admin, and so on. Now, typically what happens is the accounting happens as well. So the accounting starts the session and tracks the user's session and so on. Now, I mentioned that TACACS has 2 specialized events, command events, called command authorization and command accounting. Let's take a look at that. Now, the significance of command authorization is that once Jane gets the switch or a router prompt, for every command she types in, she needs to get authorized to execute those commands. And command accounting tracks the individual commands themselves. So at the end of it, right, when you look at ISE reports, it'll show, okay, Jane logged in at this time, and she executed these commands, show version. Now, Jane performs show version, show config, the command is authorized. But when she did config T, the command is denied. That's because Jane is a help desk admin. She is not a network admin. So in ISE, you can allow certain commands to be, you can allow certain commands and you can deny certain commands. It has permit as well as deny for commands, and these are called command sets. When we look at the demo, I will talk about these things a little more. Now, we talked about authorization, right? So where does this authorization happen, and how do you configure these things in ISE? I'll give you a very high-level overview of that before going to the demo. So there are two places in ISE where you configure these things. One is a TACACS profile. So in TACACS profile, you configure the privilege level. For network admin, the privilege level is 15. Say, for example, if this is an iOS router or an iOS switch. So there is a privilege level from 0 to 15. So for network admin, it's a very high-level privilege. For network operator, it is slightly lower level privilege. So they can execute only those commands that are allowed based on the privilege level. Now, what does the command sets do? So even though the network admin has a privilege level of 15, if you want network admins to, if you want to deny network admins permission to execute certain commands, you could still do with command sets. That's the role of command sets. Right, and you can see that the network admin has a permit config T, network operator has a deny config star, which means that we support wildcards, regex, regular expressions, and so on. Now, what happens if your third-party devices do not support TACACS? I mentioned that we support Radius, right? So in Radius, you need to configure these things. You need to configure what we did in TACACS profile in something called authorization profile. You need to bundle all these items in the authorization profile. In fact, we support third-party, ISE supports third-party Radius dictionaries as well. Okay, so let's look at a quick demo to see how it works and what you need to do to configure these items. All right. First, we'll enable the service. These are the items that you need to do, right? In the same order or in a slightly different order. This makes sense actually. You need to enable the service, and you need to add the network device that you wanted to manage to ISE, and after that, you need to add the users, external authentication servers, and finally define the policies and policy sets, and try it out before you verify logs and get the reports. All right, let's take a quick look at the demo. Now, I have ISE, and this is a server, right? And what you see is ISE Work Center. Work Center is a very contained space in ISE where you can do all the tasks related to a certain feature. Now, I go to ISE Work Center and go to Device Administration, Overview, and this gives you a workflow of what you have to do. Prepare is what you need to do before installation, right? You need to understand the authorization roles. You need to create profiles. You need to identify the user roles so that you can create profiles, command sets, and so on. And we start from here. First, we enable the deployment for TACACS, and then we go about creating identities, identity groups, add the external identity servers, add the network devices, policies, and so on. Now, the first thing you do is you go here and then you look at the options here. This is where you add the service in ISE. TACACS servers. TACACS service can be added to all policy services node or specific nodes. So when you choose specific nodes, right, you see the ISE PSN. PSN stands for Policy Services Node, right? ISE has different personas. We will talk about that in a little bit. And then you see you also can customize the port. Once you do that and save it, and it starts the TACACS service in the PSN. After that, you can go to identities. Here we are using an external identity server, which is the Active Directory server. So hence, there are no users and user groups as well. And there are some default groups that are available in ISE that is meant for device admin, that is meant for network access, that is meant for a lot of other reasons. So these are the default groups that are already available in ISE. Now, When you go to the external ID identity sources, you can see that we already have something called AD1. AD1 is the Active Directory server that was already added. So to add a Active Directory server, all you have to do is go to Active Directory and add the server using this, and then type in the admin username password, and you have to type in the domain name. Once you add the domain name, then the Active Directory gets added, and it is important for your DNS to work and all that. So once you add the Active Directory server, what you can see is that the ISE node becomes operational, right? So the ISE node gets connected to the Active Directory server, and it says that it's operational, which means that it's working. And when you see the groups, and these are the groups that we are going to use: the help desk, we have IT admins, security admins, tier 1 users, tier 2 users, device admins. And you can manage these groups as well. So you can add these groups in the policies. All right. Now the next thing you have to do is you have to go to the network resources, add the network devices. So when you add the network devices, you need to add the IP address, subnet mask, and once you do that, then you can select the device type or location. So this is an iOS device, so I configure device type as iOS devices, and the location is, it's in the dcloud. dcloud is an infrastructure that we use to host these demos, right? And then the TACACS authentication requires a password. Here you can show and retire the password as well. You can show the password, you can show the shared secret. So what happens if you change the shared secret every 6 months based on your security infrastructure, based on your security policy? So you can use a function called retire, which helps you to manage 2 passwords at the same time. So it allows password overlap for some time before the first password retires and the second password kicks in. All right. Now, network devices and network device groups are something very important. Network device groups allows you to group the network devices based on different criteria, based on device type, based on device location. So you can see that there are network devices, iOS device, Nexus, wireless devices. Same way, the location is dcloud. So you can have any number of location based on how your organization works, right? You can have Americas, Europe, Asia Pacific, or US East, US West, and all that. So the reason why you group these devices is to add these devices into policy. So let's look at that. Let's look at the policy. So before taking a look at the policy, you need to understand the policy elements. The policy elements are what you configure in the policy. So in the policy elements results, you go to something called TACACS profiles. We talked about this briefly, right? And let's take an example of iOS admin privilege. Okay, so this is where you configure the privilege level. So we have the default privilege as 15, maximum privilege as 15 as well. And we also have auto command and a bunch of other attributes. You have a task attribute view, and you also have a raw view. You can see the attribute and the value. Okay, this is where you configure the TACACS profile. For devices that support CLI and that supports command sets, you can go and configure the command sets as well. For example, for iOS security commands, right? Yeah, we allow certain commands like permit show is permitted, and interface commands is denied. Permit AAA, permit config. Okay. So when you want to add, so you can add another command. So it allows you to. It has 3 options: permit, deny, deny always. And then you have the command and arguments. So it allows wildcards as well as regex, regular expressions.
A question.
Right.
There's the request from the audience ask you to lower the resolution.
Lower the resolution? Okay.
It's saying it's too high to see. Maybe you can zoom in. I mean, the browser zoom in or something.
Okay, let me see. 1600 by 900. How is keep changes river? How is this? Is this better? Did it change anything?
We are not seeing ISE yet. I think, is that possible just zoom in the browser maybe? You know, using the browser.
I'll do that. That'll be easier. That'll be much easier. Okay. Is this better?
Yes.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shing. All right. So, let's, the external ID sources we talked about is the AD1, and then the network resources we discussed, which is the network devices and network device groups and the policy elements. We talked about that, right? And you go to results, and then you configure your TACACS profiles, command sets, and then everything comes together in device administration policy sets. Policy sets, you can look at the policy set as a grouping and a very high-level over filter. So this is what ISE uses to filter the incoming requests, right, based on the criteria or conditions here. Now, here you can see that if the device location equals all location, then use this policy set. If the device location equals all dcloud, and then if the device type equals nexus, use this policy set. So this is how we group it. So once ISE sees that the device is part of the iOS device, then it will use this particular policy set. Right? And when you click on the policy, this is the policy set, and this is the overfilter we talked about. And you have to create the authentication and the authorization policy. Authentication policy is by default created for you. You need to select the right option. Say here, for example, when you're using Active Directory as an external authentication server, what you see here is you can do AD1, or you could also combine a bunch of external ID sources and use that. And this is what you see. AD only is it starts with AD. And there are other options as well that allows you how to manage authentication failure and so on. And in the authorization policy, right, typically you can add a bunch of things. And what you can do is, if your company organizes everything in Active Directory groups, I have seen different companies do it in the different ways, and they have many Active Directory groups based on the location, based on the user role of the device administrator. So you can use those Active Directory groups here. Right? See here, we use a very simple condition where we check if the user belongs to a help desk group or security admin group and so on. And then finally, we add the command set and shell profiles. And this is what is sent. The command set and shell profile that we created in the policy element is what is sent back to the network device. Right? So once you do that, then you can go to the reports and you can look at the reports, device administration reports. So let's actually start a session. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Let's actually start. I'm a help desk user, for example, and I log in. So we have a script that runs that uses auto login, and that automatically does certain tasks. Say, for example, I want to ping the gateway, right? And I want to display the route table, right? And I want to display the interface info. All right. And then I exit out of it. Okay. Now let's go back and take a look at what ISE finds, what ISE shows in terms of logging and reporting. Okay, in the operation, when you go to the TACACS live log, and you can see that you can see the authentication and authorization we talked about. ISE authenticated the help desk user, and then it authorized the help desk user. When you click on the details, and it'll give you a complete details of what happened during the transaction. So the steps, detailed steps as to what happened before and during the transaction. You see that the help desk user is allowed privilege level 1. Auto command, it ran auto command menu, so that's why we saw the menu there, right? So when you look at the reports, under device administration, you have many reports under device administration. You can see, you start with TACACS authentication. So you see that TACACS help desk user is authenticated. So help desk user authenticated at this particular time, the network device, device type, and so on, device port, and so on, right? It also shows the IP address of the remote user. The remote address is the IP address of the user. Once the authentication is complete, then you get to the authorization part, where you'll see the logged in time, and you see that the users are authorized successfully with the remote address, and you see the privilege also. You see the shell profile and the command sets that are being used for authorization. All right. And if you look at the accounting, you could see the start and stop. You could see when it started and when it stopped. Now, you also see the command accounting part. So I talked about command authorization and accounting, right? So in the command accounting, right, every command that is executed is tracked. So for example, the user did a ping. The first an auto command was run with menu called help desk, and then the user ran a ping. And after that, I did a show IP route and show interface gig 1. So all of these things are tracked. So it helps you, command authorization and accounting helps you audit the tasks of the device admin. And it helps you log and it helps with logging and auditing. All right, so let's go back to our So before we jump back to our discussion, let's take a quick poll. Before that, and I wanted to get an idea about the answers of the previous poll as well. Rigo, do you have the answers from the previous poll?
Yes, absolutely. So let's see. For our first poll, we wanted to know, what do you use for device admin? And based on these answers, the slim majority said that we're using both TACACS and Radius, and the runner-up answer was TACACS.
Excellent. So I see that some of you might have third-party devices or a necessity to use Radius as device administration. So now the second poll question. I'm interested in understanding your network itself, right? So how many network devices do you have? Less than 2,000, 2,000 to 4,000, 2,000 to 10,000, 10,000 to 30,000, 30,000 to 100,000, and greater than 100,000. I'll give you a few seconds. All right, let's move on. Thanks for taking this question. All right, we talked about TACACS, right? And we also talked about the AAA events and 2 special events called command events and all that. What is the significance of this, right? And we will look at that in a little bit. Now, when you look at the combination of these events, and you have 5 different events. You have the session, authentication, authorization, accounting. We saw that, and we saw the command authorization and command accounting as well, right? Now, what happens here is that a user logs in to the switch or a router and execute, say for example, she or he executes a couple of commands: show version, show running config, right? Now the number of transactions will be equals the three AAA events we talked about, plus the 2 command events. These command events are run per command. For every command run, you will see the command authorization and command accounting. Since it is per command, right, the number of events, and if you were your elementary school math hat, you see that it is 7 events for a single session. Every time a user logs in and performs these 2 commands and logs out, that is 1 session. You will see that there are 7 events that are triggered, right? Now, why is it important to understand the number of events triggered? And we will talk about that in a little bit. So before that, what happens if you have lots of admin, a handful of admin, not lots of admin, or a script that runs at different points of time in a day, right? Let's take a look at that example. Okay, so before looking at that example, right, let's generalize the formula that we had from the previous slide. So we had 3 AAA events and 2 command events, and in the last slide we had 2 commands. We executed 2 commands, and now we wanted to generalize to n commands. N could be any number. So I've created a table. So I have 2 items. One is the number of commands run, another one is transactions per session. So let's calculate the transactions per second as we run the number of commands. So for 2 commands, right, n equals 2, the calculation comes to 7 transactions per second. For 4, n equals 4, it becomes 11. For 8, it becomes 19. For 10, it becomes 23. So all I did was I replaced n with 10. 10 multiplied by 2 is 20. 20 plus 3 is 23. It's a simple elementary math calculation. Okay? So let's take this example. We have 23 transactions if we run 10 commands per session. All right? Now, why is it important? So when you are setting up an ISE deployment, you need to understand the number of nodes you need, number of policy services nodes. Each policy services node support a certain number of transactions. So if you know the number of transactions you need based on the network devices you have, right? We will see an example in the next slide. Then it is easy how many ISE policy services node you need in your deployment and calculate it based on that. Okay, let's take an example here. My company has 10,000 network devices, and I want to implement TACACS. And I have a combination of humans and scripts and the humans and script both monitor my network, and they gather information from the network, and I run 10 commands every time my script runs. Okay. Now there are a few things we know already. So number of network devices in my deployment is 10,000. This is pretty obvious, right? Now let's calculate the number of transactions. It's a very simple math. We know that for 10 commands, we have 23 transactions from our previous slide. So you just plug in 23 there. 23 multiplied by 10,000 is 230,000 transactions, or 230,000 events. Right. Now, what we are interested in is to calculate the transactions per second. For that, you need to approximate certain things. Say, for example, you have scripts that goes about gathering information from all these 10,000 network devices, and it takes around 20 minutes for the script to complete its task and log out, right? So we are now approximating it. Like, if it takes, it could take more or it could take less, but we are using this number. Now the peak transactions per second is 230,000 divided by 20 minutes, which equals 200 transactions per second approximately. It comes to 191. I've approximated that to 200. Right? Now, if your script runs 4 times, what happens is you just multiply that. It becomes 800 transactions per second. Okay, so now you know that you have 800 transactions per second. So how do you calculate this? So you could calculate this using logs if you have Splunk, or if you have syslogs, and you could look at these transactions as logs. Right? You could look at these events: authentication, authorization, accounting, command authorization, command accounting, and all that. So if you turn on command authorization, command accounting for 10 commands, right? For 4, if you run across 10,000 network devices, we have calculated that it comes down to 800 transactions per second. This is great, right? But some of you said that my network also uses third-party or devices that may not support TACACS. So what do you do in that case? So you need to do device administration with Radius, right? So there are a couple of things for device administration with Radius. First thing is you need to talk to your vendor or gather information from vendor. And you can also gather vendor dictionaries, and ISE supports third-party Radius dictionaries as well to ISE, right? And once you do that, then you need to create the authorization profile based on the third-party Radius dictionaries and add that to the policy sets. Okay, and then you have to create the ISE policy set as well. Now, I will show you quickly where to import the Radius dictionaries if you have third-party, right? So when you go to ISE, right, instead of device admin, you go to network access. Network access is where is everything about Radius. I mentioned that Radius is not typically used for device administration. It is used for network access, right? So anything related to Radius, you go here. So you go to the network access dictionaries, and you see that in system. You go to Radius and Radius vendors, and you see that we already have dictionaries from all these different vendors. All you have to do is add one more vendor, right? Say, for example, let's look at this Brocade switch, right? So we have dictionary attributes, and we have these auth role. So we have auth role, and you have different AV pairs. So if you, for example, if you're using Brocade switch, you could use these Radius dictionaries. And if you're using a third-party switch or a router, all you have to do is add the Radius dictionaries here. Once you do that, you go to the policy elements, and I mentioned authorization profile, right? So let's go to the authorization profile. And once you go to the you can create the authorization profile. You can create a new authorization profile, and you can select third party, say Brocade, auth role, right, and type in the role, and use this in the policy set. All right, so let's continue with our discussion. So I have also added a couple of hidden slides, and that shows you, that compares and shows the difference between TACACS and Radius, and those are the things that are here, and that's meant for reference. We talked about this, we talked about this, we talked about this as well. Now let's take a look at the difference between Radius and TACACS. Why do you need to use Radius versus TACACS, or why use TACACS versus Radius? The most important thing, I would say, from a protocol standpoint, is TACACS is TCP based. It's connection oriented. For every transaction, for every TCP transmission, there is an acknowledgement sent. Right, and that is what connection oriented means, and it is reliable. And if you have lossy links, and it is very resilient, all of that is based on TCP. UDP is connectionless, and there is no acknowledgement. And there are some standard ports that are used. TACACS, you can also customize the port, just to remember. The intended purpose for TACACS is device admin. I've mentioned it a few times. I'm not going to say it again. For people who are security conscious, TACACS encrypts the full packet. Maybe the first header is an exception. Radius, it encrypts only the password. Now, the last two items are the most important items. TACACS offers flexibility where you can have any authentication server. You can have a Kerberos server, you can have an Active Directory server, you can have RSA, you can have Duo, right? You can have a variety of external authentication server, because it separates authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, in essence, right, TACACS offers flexibility. It is more robust. It has third-party support, even though TACACS Plus is Cisco's proprietary protocol and was created in 70s and 80s, right? It has evolved so much, and there are a lot of third party who support TACACS. And for Radius, it has even more third-party support, and it is easier to implement as well. But you have to gather the information from the Radius vendors, right? The dictionaries, and then import that in ISE, so that you understand the vendor ID, the attributes that need to be used, and all that. All right, a quick poll. Rigo, can you open up the poll? Do we have answers from the previous poll, Rigo?
Yes, we do. For the second poll, we asked how many network devices our attendees had, and an overwhelming amount of participants said they had less than 2,000 network devices. Okay, fantastic. So with 2,000 network devices, you don't have to worry too much about deployment modes. You can have a very simple deployment mode, and that actually saves you a lot of time, effort, and money as well. All right. So a quick poll, what are your choices for device administration now? Now that you understood the difference between TACACS and Radius, is your choice the same? Or you're still undecided? Or whether it's TACACS or Radius? I'll give you a few seconds to answer the question. Okay, so let's move on.
All right, so I talked about device administration policies, right? ISE is a policy server. So before you define the device administration policy, right, you need to understand a few things. It is important to plan this out first. The first thing you need to understand is the role of the admin user themselves. So you have network admins, you have help desk, you have security admins, and so on, and these are different types of role. I would suggest creating a table. So once you know the roles, then you actually understand or come up with the level of privileges and permissions for these type of admins, independent of the routers or switches or the network devices they want to access. So you come up with a small table with the admin role and the privileges that they need. For example, a network admin may have full privileges and full access. A help desk admin can have only read-only access, right, with show commands. A security admin can have full privileges for UI as well as CLI based on the security device, and this is meant for security devices, right? So these are the examples. Once you come up with this little table, then you can add the conditions and criteria based on what ISE supports, right? And then you can add policy conditions. Say, first you wanted to check if the network admin is part of the network admin Active Directory group, right? You also want to check if the network admin can access device, only certain devices. Say, for example, these are router admins, so they wanted to access only routers. So you add all these routers into a group called routers, right? And then you make sure you have the policy sets with those groups, right, as we saw before. And you can also enable these, group these network devices based on device location. For example, you have network admins who are in US East Coast location, right, and who are router admins. So you have all these things in the policy set, and you use the Active Directory group in the authorization policy to verify if the users are part of this particular net admin group, and then give full privileges and permissions, right? So these are some of the policy, these are some of the best practices when you define the policies. You need to understand the roles, you need to understand the privilege permissions, and use the conditions in the right way. In fact, I have a hidden slide and that explains all the different conditions that you can use across the policy set, the authentication, and the authorization policy. So you can go through it at your leisure. All right, just a quick recap on ISE deployment fundamentals, right? So if you have a very simple deployment, right, you could go with a standalone node with an HA pair. HA is high availability pair. Now ISE has something called personas or functional roles, right? So we have admin persona or functional role. Admin is used for managing the policies, creating new policies, users, devices, network devices, groups, and so on. So I logged in as an admin in the ISE user interface, and I configured all of that. And that persona is called admin persona. Now I also looked at the logs, right? Logs and reporting. That is done by the monitoring persona. And the heart of ISE deployment is the policy services persona. That actually talks to the network devices, and that also authenticates the users and talks to the external authentication servers, authorizes the users, and it is the main interface between the user and the authentication servers that lies behind. It authorizes these users. Now, these three personas are important: admin, MNT, and PSNs. And I'm not going to talk about PXGrid because PXGrid is not used in TACACS. Okay. Since a lot of you have only 2,000 devices, this may not be applicable, but just in case, for people who have a large deployment spread across geographies, right? And this would be a fully distributed deployment. We support up to 100,000 network devices. So in case of a large deployment, you can have your primary admin monitoring nodes in 2 different data centers. You can have PSN spread across different locations. Now, I would suggest separating the PAN and MNT if you have greater than 5 PSN. If you have less than 5 PSN, you can combine PAN and MNT together, right? And between PAN and the other nodes, the typical delay we support is 300 milliseconds. The last point is a very important point. You'll have to co-locate the PSNs with the Active Directory. What it means is when the user authenticates, to avoid any delays or issues, we have seen from the field and from experience that the Active Directory global catalog server that is used for authentication should be co-located in the same site as the PSN, so to give optimum performance. Okay. That said, let's talk about deployment models. For a large enterprise, right, I would suggest separating TACACS as well as radius, right? So you have this may not be applicable to a lot of you, right? Because you might have a smaller deployment with 2,000 network devices and so on. But in case if your deployment is large and you have 2 sets of users managing TACACS as well as network access. Network access means if you have .1x, MAC, authentication bypass, and other services running in your network, right? So you need a separate deployment for that. This is to avoid any impact of device administration over network access and vice versa, and also for logging. So wireless typically creates lots of logs. So this is TACACS also creates lots of logs. So if you are interested in logging and auditing, this is to avoid that. Now this may be more suitable because to a lot of you, because you have network access as well as device administration. So you have a smaller set of admins who can manage both, and you have dedicated nodes for TACACS as well as radius, so that the impact is lower. If the TACACS, if the PSN managing TACACS goes down, there is no impact for your network access user, and vice versa, right? You can also use shared deployment to optimize cost, right? And this could be used for small businesses, right? And if you have high network access, high profile network access user, you need to be aware of that because the PSNs and the PAN, MNT, they are shared between these 2 different services. So the impact on one service will cause impact on users that are using the other service. All right. Now, when you think about a deployment, you also have to consider resiliency from failures. So what happens if my PSN goes down, right? Typically, you have a secondary PSN. In fact, network device can support up to 3 different PSNs, and that could be an overkill. But I'm just saying that you could have a secondary PSN per site. I've seen big companies do this. If the primary PSN goes down, traffic is routed to a secondary PSN. You can also use a different strategy where you have a group of PSNs. If the PSNs go down, then you have a centralized PSN at a regional data center, right? Now, just a quick blurb on licensing. For device administration, post 2.4, right? Like we have licensing per node, where for every node you turn on TACACS, you need to purchase device administration license. And this is in parity with ACS. For those of you who've used ACS, and this is just like ACS. Now we have three choices of appliance, 3600 series, 3615s, 55s, and 95s. Now talking about the transactions per second, and now we are summarizing that. Now you can see that 3615 supports 1,000 transactions per second. So in our calculation, we saw that we had around 800 transactions per second. So for your network, one PSN 3615 or a VM equivalent would do, right? Or you could do a 3655, which supports 1,500 transactions per second if you have more number of runs, script runs, right? I did not include 3695 because 3695 is typically used for PAN or MNT, right? 3695 supports a lot of CPU, a lot of memory, so you can use it for MNT as a large MNT box if you're using for audit and logging. All right, to summarize everything, right, like I had the slide. So the important thing is for you to understand from a very high level, these are the design consideration of goals, right? You have to choose the number of PSNs. You need to understand the number of logs per day to see what kind of appliance you need for MNT, right? When you design your deployment, you also need to think about single point of failure, service failure, and so on. Now, if you look at this graph, right, like you have the the transactions per second in the bottom. The horizontal line represents the transactions per second. So it starts with a 0 transactions per second. Nothing happens. And then anything between 0 to 1,500 transactions per second, or if you have a single site, single location, right, you could go with a standalone deployment with NHA pair. Say if you have a manufacturing site or if you have a central office in one site, this is an example of that. Right? If you have a multi-location, say for East Coast or West Coast, right, you have different sites, and that supports more than 1,500 transactions per second. You could have a limited deployment with 2 PAN and MNTs. Here, PAN and MNT can be combined together in one node, and you can go up to 2 or more PSNs based on your redundancy, based on what kind of redundancy you need in your network. And if you have a geographically dispersed sites across continents, across countries, and if you need log retention as well, and say, for example, if your logs go through more than 3 million logs per day, right, you might need an external logging server. So in this example, right, to the right, you can see that you need 2 PAN, 2 MNT, and 2 PSNs or more. This is again based on the appliances we talked about earlier and the transactions per second for those appliances as well. All right, so everything is explained. Whatever I've explained here is very well explained and written in this prescriptive deployment guide. I walk through the design, deployment, best practices, how to implement with examples and so on. Right? Just have to Google ISE Prescriptive Deployment Guide and you will hit that. Just a quick poll. Before the poll, do we have answers for the previous poll, Rigo?
Yes, we do. So let's see here. In the previous poll, we wanted to know from our attendees what their choice was for device administration. And wow, it looks like almost half of our participants went with TACACS as their preferred choice.
Excellent. Excellent choice. I understand that half the participants might need radius support as well, and we discussed that. So ISE supports both radius as well as TACACS. All right. So I'd like to understand the tools that you use. You know, whether you use humans, human administrators, scripts, proprietary tools, third-party tools, or a combination of that. So please take a moment to answer this. I understand that we are on top of the hour, so I would take extra 5 minutes of your time to complete 1 or 2 more slides, and we will wrap it up. All right, let's move on. Okay, this is one last slide, and I'd like to talk about TACACS using Duo multi-factor authentication. And you all know that Cisco has bought Duo, and Duo is actually good when it comes to a multi-factor authentication. That's one of the reasons why we bought Duo, because it takes care of users who are remote, right? And it does more than multi-factor authentication. It does zero trust and so on. But when you think about multi-factor authentication and its use, say for example, this is Jane. Jane wants to access the network device. She types in the username and a password, right? And it is sent to ISE, and ISE actually sends it to the authentication proxy, which belongs to the Duo, and Duo talks to the Active Directory and performs the first authentication. Multi-factor authentication is more than one factor. Usually it is the username, password as one factor, and the second factor could be hardware token, software token, PIN, one-time password, and so on. Duo uses a variety of one-time passwords. It can push the one-time passwords to the user's mobile device, or the users can generate one-time passwords themselves. Now, the first factor is done. Once the first factor completes, then the authentication proxy opens up a tunnel to the Duo cloud, and the user is asked for the one-time password. The user provides the one-time password, right? And it is verified. Once it is verified, then the authorization happens. ISE authorizes the user and allows the right privilege as well as permission for the user to access the network device. Now, this is how the entire thing works. Here are some of the resources that you can use for device administration. So the first thing I would say is our device admin community page. So this has a lot of information on different sets of use cases. It also has attributes. It also has links to the third-party radius dictionary I talked about. Right? It has links to the prescriptive guide I talked about as well. And the second resource you might want to bookmark is these two URL, CSCO ISE resources, CSCO ISE community. Now, if you have questions on design implementation, and if you have some kind of configuration errors, or if you don't know what to do, how to progress, this is where you go and ask questions, right? If you have serious problems with your network, and I would suggest calling TAC, because when you ask questions in the ISE community, typically it takes with less than 24 hours for the first response. We have a lot of people from customer experience, from TMEs. TMEs typically monitor this, and you will get a response within 24 hours. Now, ISE community is where you go to gather all the information on ISE, like device admin, all the different use cases that ISE supports. All right, one last poll. What is the next topic that you want us to have as a webinar? Before that, do you have answers for our previous poll?
I do, yes. Yeah, so previous poll, we asked attendees what tools they are using to manage network devices, and we have a good range of diverse results, but the answer that took the top spot was a combination of humans and tools, and then this was followed by only humans and no tools, which came in at number 2nd.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for sharing this information with me, and I give you a few seconds for answering the poll. All right. Are there any questions that are unanswered that needs to be looked into, or is everything answered so far?
So it looks like most of the questions are answered. I do see one open question here. And the attendee wants to, or the user wants to know, do I support Tripwire as a remote server?
If the Tripwire supports standard radius or TACACS, yes, of course. You'll have to understand if the Tripwire supports radius. Again, as I mentioned, you need to get the vendor dictionaries from Tripwire themselves and import that in ISE. If you do not have vendor dictionaries, you need to go and explore their documentation and find the vendor ID and the attribute name, value, and all that, so that you can add these information in ISE when you create the authorization policy, authorization profile.
Great, thank you so much.
Okay.
So let's see, one other question here is there a place where I can see how many TPS I am using right now?
Right, so yes, that's a great question. In fact, a lot of people have asked this question. If you're using an existing product, if you're using a product that you wanted to, and you wanted to move to ISE, you could look at the logs of the existing product. Usually these have logs. And you'll have to look at all the different types of logs, authentication, authorization, accounting, and all that, to understand how many authentications you did per day or authorization you did per day, and combine everything together to look at the number of transactions per day, right? And if you have a syslog server like Splunk, you could use that as well. And you could create a separate dashboard, a separate report that shows the authentications, authorization, accounting, and you could calculate that as well. So you could do that. You could do either ways. So you have to monitor for an hour of peak usage and use that for your calculation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And let's see, is it possible to integrate with SD-WAN? And is it scalable with level?
Yes, of course. So as long as the SD-WAN products that you have, in case if you're using Cisco, if it supports external radius server or TACACS server, yes, of course, like you can use any product that supports standard radius or TACACS Plus for integrating with ISE.
Okay, great. And let's see. Can you import device lists into ISE using CVF, etc.?
Using what?
CSV, I'm sorry.
CFD.
CSV?
Oh, CSD?
CSV?
Oh, CSV. Okay.
CSV, yeah.
Okay, yeah. You can import when you go to the network devices, you could add network devices either manually or import Cisco network devices using a template, using CSVs and so on. Yes, that's possible. And in fact, like we also support APIs. So if you have automation tools, you can create network devices using APIs, and that's also supported.
Okay, great. So I think that's all we have for today. Is there anything else, Krishna, that you'd like to share with our attendees before we close out for today?
I think we are done, and I'd like to thank the attendees for taking the time, and I'm hoping that this would have added value in understanding the device administration, so that they can take the next steps in implementing device administration using TACACS or Radius or whatever in their network. Thank you very much for attending.
Thank you so much, Krishnan. And just wanted to quickly share the results for the very final poll question. So we asked, what topics they would be interested in seeing in future webinars. And our winner here is security integration. So this is actually really great feedback on the topics, and it will be really helpful to the team to determine what topics to cover in future webinars. So we thank you so much for submitting this feedback. Okay, so so again, thank you so much, Krishnan, for this great presentation today and for sharing these important resources and information, as well as your knowledge about the topic with our attendees. I would also like to thank our panelists for their help in answering all of our questions during the session. I did want to quickly remind our attendees that you will receive a short pop-up survey as soon as you exit, and we would really appreciate it if you took just a few minutes to complete it and let us know how you liked the presentation. Also, I would like to mention that we do have an upcoming webinar next month on October 2nd, and we will be covering ISE wired access, so we invite you to join us for that session as well. For your reference, I posted the ISE training videos page link in the chat window, and that's where you can register for the upcoming webinar, as well as watch the video recordings for our previous sessions. So we do encourage you to check that out as well. You will actually be receiving an email within about an hour or two that will contain that same ISE page link, so no worries if you forget to save it. We'll have that sent to you via email. Thanks again to Krishnan, our panelists, and all of our attendees for joining us today. I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you all.